a blinding white curtain smothered the jagged hills of Thessaly. Visibility was less than 20 paces. On this morning in 197 BCE, the only warning was the sound, the heavy, rhythmic thud of thousands of hobnailed boots grinding against stone muffled by the damp air. Suddenly a single bird call cut through. The silence followed immediately by the wet, sharp crunch of a spear hitting a breastplate. A scout screamed. In the heart of the mist, two massive predators had just bumped into each other in the dark. For 2 centuries, the Macedonian Phalanx was the engine of god-kings. It was a forest of 20-foot pikes that had conquered the known world from Greece to India, a machine so perfect that no force on earth could withstand its frontal charge. But on these rocky ridges known as the Dog's Heads, that engine died. It did not die because its soldiers lacked courage, nor because they were outnumbered. It died because for the first time in history, the machine met an enemy that did not break but bent. The invincible wall of Alexander the Great was about to be dismantled. Peace, by bloody peace, by the flexible violence of the Roman legion. Welcome back to World Chronicles. This is the collision that decided the fate of the Mediterranean. Today we witness the death of the old world and the brutal birth of the Roman Empire at the Battle of Cynoscephalae. The year was 197 BCE. The Mediterranean was holding its breath. To the west, the Roman Republic had just finished breaking the back of Carthage, ending the Second Punic War and emerging as a hungry, terrifying new superpower. But the Romans were not done. Their gaze had turned east toward the ancient golden lands of Greece and specifically toward the man who claimed to be the heir of Alexander the Great, King Philip V of Macedon. Philip was a seasoned commander of the Antigonid dynasty, a man who had spent his life keeping the rebellious Greek city-states under the Macedonian boot. He commanded a professional army built around the legendary Phalanx, a formation that had dominated battlefields for over a century. Facing him was Titus Quinctius Flamininus, a Roman consul not yet 30 years old. Flamininus was a new breed of Roman, a lover of Greek culture who was fluent in their language yet possessing the cold, iron ruthlessness of a legionary commander. He had come not just to fight, but to break the Macedonian hegemony over Greece once and for all. For weeks, these two massive armies, each numbering nearly 25,000 men, had been stalking each other across the plains of Thessaly in a deadly game of cat and mouse. It was early spring, and the campaign had been grueling. The Roman legionaries marched under the crushing weight of their sarcina, the 60-pound marching packs that included weapons, rations, and tools, earning them the nickname Marius's mules in later generations. They trudged through mud and cold rain, their iron hobnails grinding down the uneven roads, while Philip's phalangites, burdened with their heavy 20-foot sarissas, mirrored their movements on the opposite side of the hills. Both commanders were desperate for supplies. The countryside had been stripped bare by the war, and hunger was becoming as dangerous an enemy as the opposing army. Philip sought the high ground to preserve his advantage, while Flamininus hunted for a chance to catch the Macedonians on flat terrain where his legions could maneuver. They moved in parallel lines, separated only by a ridge of sharp, jagged hills known to the locals as Cynoscephalae, or the Dog's Heads. By all logic, the decisive clash should have happened days later on a chosen field of battle. Both generals believed they were miles apart, screened from one another by the rough terrain. But the weather in Thessaly has a mind of its own. As the sun rose on that fateful morning, a dense, wet fog rolled down from the peaks, blinding the scouts and dampening the sounds of the march. Neither Philip nor Flamininus knew that. They were walking their armies into a collision course on ground that would doom one of them. The stage was set not by strategy, but by the blind, chaotic hand of nature. On paper, the battle should have been a massacre in favor of the Macedonians. King Philip V commanded a military machine that had been perfected over 150 years. Imagine a living, breathing fortress of men. The phalanx was not just a crowd of soldiers. It was a mathematical equation of violence. 16 ranks deep, shoulder to shoulder. Each man carried a sarissa, a massive pike made of cornel wood reaching up to 20 feet in length. When the order came, the first 5 ranks lowered these spears, creating an impenetrable forest of steel points projecting outward. To charge a phalanx from the front was suicide. Horses refused to run into it, and men were skewered before they could even swing a sword. It was a sledgehammer designed for one purpose: to crush everything in its path through sheer, overwhelming frontal pressure. But the Roman legion was a different kind of predator. While the phalanx was a single, rigid sledgehammer, the legion was an articulated hand capable of making a fist or gripping with individual fingers. Flamininus commanded the manipulator system, the famous checkerboard formation. His troops were divided into small, independent units called Maniples, arranged in 3 lines: the raw hastati in the front, the prime principes in the middle, and the veteran Schreieri at the rear. Each Roman legionary carried a large, curved shield, the scutum, and a short, terrifyingly efficient stabbing sword, the gladius. They were not designed to hold a line endlessly. They were designed to cycle fresh troops into the meat grinder, exhausting the enemy through rotation. Where the phalanx relied on rigidity and momentum, the legion relied on flexibility and endurance. The contrast extended to the commanders themselves. Philip V was a hardened veteran of decades of Greek warfare, a king fighting to preserve the twilight of his dynasty. Flamininus was young, ambitious, and hungry for dignitas, the unique Roman concept of prestige and reputation. He knew that the phalanx had one fatal flaw: to work, it needed perfectly flat ground. On rough terrain, the rigid formation would break apart, opening gaps in the wall of spears. And as the mist began to swirl around the jagged, uneven ridges of Cynoscephalae, the terrain itself was about to become the third participant in the battle and the phalanx's worst enemy. The mist didn't just hide the enemy, it erased the world. On the ridges of Cynoscephalae, the limestone peaks jutted out like the teeth of a buried giant, creating a broken, uneven landscape that was a nightmare for military formations. For a phalanx, which required a seamless, unbroken line of pikes to function, this terrain was a death trap. But in the blindness of the morning, neither commander could see the ground beneath their feet. It began with a blunder. A Roman reconnaissance force consisting of 10 cavalry squadrons and a handful of light infantry was probing through the whiteout, searching for wheat, not war. Suddenly, shapes materialized out of the gloom. Macedonian heavy infantry, stationed on the ridge. There were no speeches, no drawn battle lines. Just the sudden panicked shout of discovery followed by the wet thud of javelins. The skirmish exploded instantly. The Romans, outnumbered and disoriented, were driven back down the slope, retreat chaotic and bloody. Flamininus, hearing the panic of his scouts, reacted with instinct rather than strategy. He fed 500 cavalry and 2,000 infantry into the mist to rescue them. The tide turned violently. Now the Macedonians were the ones being butchered, pushed back up the rocky incline. Seeing his outposts collapsing, King Philip threw his own reserves into the fray to stabilize the line. What started as a chance encounter rapidly spiraled into a deadly escalation ladder. Neither general had planned for a battle that day, but the machinery of war had been switched on and it was hungry. The fighting was savage and blind. Men stabbed at silhouettes, unsure if they were striking friend or foe, until the metal bit home. The screams of the dying echoed strangely in the fog, making the enemy seem everywhere and nowhere at once. High on the ridge, King Philip listened to the chaotic reports. He knew the terrain was suicide for his phalanx. He knew he should pull back. But then, a breathless messenger arrived from the front line with a report that would override all his wisdom and seal the fate of his kingdom. 0.5. The messenger gasped that the enemy was fleeing, and the day belonged to the king. Philip V looked down from the high ridge. Through the thinning mist, he could see the Roman skirmishers falling back in disorder. It was a trap of temptation. The terrain was still jagged, still uneven, a graveyard for a phalanx. But the sight of a retreating enemy is a powerful drug. Philip made the decision that would define his legacy. He ordered his right wing, the elite, peltists, and the steadiest veterans of the phalanx to drop their heavy packs, level their spears, and charge. What followed was a display of raw kinetic terror. 8,000 men, acting as a single organism, lowered their 20-foot sarissas. The sound was like a thunderclap, a sudden synchronized crack of wood against shields. Then gravity took over. The Macedonian right wing surged downhill, a glittering landslide of iron and bronze. The impact was catastrophic. The Roman left wing, caught on the lower slopes, didn't just break. It was pulverized. The legionaries, with their short swords and curved shields, found themselves helpless against the wall of pike points. A Roman soldier could not even get within striking distance of his enemy. If he slashed the first pike, 3 more were aimed at his throat. If he tried to push forward, he was impaled. The phalanx rolled over. Then, like a machine, the front ranks of the Roman hastati were skewered, lifted off their feet, and trampled into the mud. The discipline of the legion crumbled under the sheer weight of the push. Roman officers screamed for the men to hold the line, but there was no line to hold, only a chaotic retreat toward the camp. The ground shook under the rhythmic stomp of the Macedonian advance, a heartbeat of doom that grew louder with every step. Flamininus, watching from the center, saw his left wing disintegrating. He saw the eagle standards toppling into the dirt. To any observer, the battle was lost. The invincible legion was being fed into a meat grinder. But amidst the slaughter, the young Roman consul noticed a strange anomaly on the far side of the battlefield, a fatal delay that Philip, in his fury, had failed to see. While Philip was tasting victory on the right, disaster was unfolding. On the left, the Macedonian army had been split in two by the jagged spine of the hills. Nicanor, the commander of the Macedonian left wing, was desperately trying to bring his men up the ridge to join the king. But the terrain was fighting him. His 5,000 heavy infantry were not in battle formation. They were strung out in long, breathless marching columns, scrambling over rocks and through scrub, brush. Their 20-foot pikes carried upright like heavy masts in a storm. They were tired, disorganized, and completely unaware that the battle had already begun. Flamininus saw the gap. He realized in a split second that he could do nothing to save his crumbling left wing. If he turned back to help them, the momentum of Philip's charge would crush his entire army. So, he did the unthinkable. He ignored him. Turning his back on the slaughter, Flamininus galloped to his own right wing, the Principes and Triarii, who were fresh and waiting. He shouted for them to strike the unformed enemy. He didn't just send infantry. He unleashed his trump card, the war elephants. These were not the massive African beasts of Carthage, but smaller, agile Indian elephants procured from his allies. With a terrifying trumpet blast that shook the mist from the air, the beasts charged uphill. The impact was sickeningly one-sided. Nicanor's men, caught in marching order, never even had a chance to lower their pikes. The elephants crashed into the disorganized columns like boulders rolling through wheat. Men were tossed into the air or trampled into red paste before they could draw their swords. The Roman legionaries followed in the wake of the beasts, hacking down the confused Macedonians with ruthless efficiency. The Macedonian left didn't break, it evaporated. Panic spread like a virus, and within minutes, thousands of Philip's best soldiers were throwing down their shields and running for their lives. Now the battlefield was a grotesque mirror image. On the low ground, Philip was slaughtering the Roman left. On the high ground, Flamininus was butchering the Macedonian left. The battle was technically a draw, a stalemate of mutual destruction. The victor would be whoever stopped killing the enemy in front of them and turned to face the enemy behind them. And that decision would not come from a king or a consul, but from a man whose name history almost forgot. The battle was now a disjointed mess. It was a race to see which general could annihilate the other's army first. In any other era, under any other system, the commanders would have continued their separate pursuits until exhaustion set in. But the Roman military machine possessed a secret weapon that Philip's rigid hierarchy did not: the initiative of the junior officer. Amidst the smoke and confusion of the victorious Roman right, an anonymous military tribune looked back. He saw his consul's left wing collapsing under the weight of Philip's charge. He did not wait for orders. He did not send a messenger. Ky Flamininus. He simply acted. The tribune shouted a command that would end the Macedonian Empire. He detached 20 Maniples, about 2,000 heavy infantry, from the rear of the formation. Wheeling them around in perfect order, he marched them not down the hill to chase the fleeing enemy, but across the spine of the ridge, directly toward the exposed rear of Philip's victorious phalanx. This was the moment the phalanx died. The genius of the Macedonian formation was also its fatal curse. A phalangite is a cog in a machine. Shoulder to shoulder with the men is beside him, holding a 20-foot sarissa with both hands. To fight an enemy in front, he is invincible. But to fight an enemy behind him, he is helpless. He cannot turn. To turn around, he must lift his massive pike vertically, pivot his body, and lower it again, a maneuver that takes precious seconds and requires the entire unit to move in sync. The 20 Roman Maniples hit them before they even knew they were there. It was not a battle, it was a collision of physics. The legionaries, armed with gladi and heavy scuda, slammed into the unprotected backs of the Macedonians. The result was instant, claustrophobic horror. The rear ranks of the phalanx tried to drop their pikes and draw their daggers, but they were packed too tightly to move. They were trapped between the Romans, pushing from behind, and their own comrades pushing forward. The invincible wall of pikes crumpled from the inside out. Panic moved through the Macedonian ranks, faster than any order. The structural integrity of the formation shattered. Men who had been screaming in triumph seconds ago were now screaming in terror as the Roman short swords went to work, stabbing and thrusting with the rhythmic efficiency of butchers. The Macedonians were no longer an army. They were a trapped herd. What followed wasn't a battle anymore. It was an execution. The disintegration of the Macedonian army was absolute. Trapped between the Roman left wing, holding the line in front, and the 20 Maniples butchering them from behind. The Phalangites found themselves in a crushing machine of their own making. The panic was infectious, spreading from the rear ranks forward like a shockwave. Men who had been drilled since boyhood to hold their ground now threw down their heavy shields and tried to run, only to trip over the bodies of their comrades or be cut down by the relentless Roman gladi. In a desperate attempt to save themselves, thousands of Macedonians performed the universal Hellenistic signal of surrender. They raised their 18-foot sarissas vertically into the air. It was a forest of wood and iron, a plea for mercy recognized by every Greek army for centuries. But the Romans did not speak the language of Greek warfare. To the legionaries flushed with the adrenaline of the kill, the raised pikes looked like a reforming battle line, not a white flag. Flamininus, seeing the signal, tried to ride forward to accept the surrender, but he was too late. His men charged into the standing, defenseless masses hacking them down where they stood. The surrender became a massacre. Cynoscephalae, King Philip V, watching from a high ridge on the far right, saw the destruction of his life's work. He saw his elite Pelican Guard, the heavy infantry, and the pride of Macedon, turned into a disorganized mob of fugitives. Realizing that the day, and perhaps his dynasty, was lost, the king gathered a small escort of Thracian cavalry and fled north toward the Vale of Tempe, leaving his army to die in the mud. By the time the sun finally burned off, the lingering fog, the scale of the disaster was visible to all. The slopes of Cynoscephalae were carpeted with the dead. 8,000 Macedonians lay slain, their bodies entangled in the wreckage of their own pikes. Another 5,000 were marched away, in chains to be sold in the slave markets of Italy. In exchange for the destruction of the greatest military power in the East, Rome had paid a butcher's bill of only 700 men. The mist had cleared, but the world it revealed was irrevocably changed. The Antigonid army was not just defeated, it was extinct. The war ended in the mud of Thessaly, but the true conquest of Greece took place a year later, not on a battlefield, but in a stadium. At the Isthmian Games of 196 BCE, amidst the roar of a massive crowd gathered. From every city-state, a Roman herald stepped forward. He read a proclamation from the Senate, and Titus Flamininus, the Macedonians were expelled, the garrisons were removed, and the Greeks were to be free, exempt from tribute and governed by their own laws. The crowd was so stunned, they asked him to read it again. When the reality sank in, the shout of joy was so loud that legends say birds flying overhead fell, dead from the shockwave. But the birds were the only ones who truly escaped. The Greeks had traded a master who lived next door for a master who lived across the sea. Rome had not liberated Greece, it had merely cleared out a rival landlord. Flamininus became the patron of the entire Greek world, and the Senate became the final arbiter of every dispute. The chains of iron had been replaced by chains of gold and gratitude, but they were chains nonetheless. The military verdict even more absolute. Cynoscephalae was the death knell of the system that Alexander the Great had built. The rigid, unstoppable pike phalanx had been exposed as a dinosaur, terrifying in its power, but too clumsy to survive. In a changing world, it had been dismantled by the Roman legion, a system of interchangeable parts, flexible lines, and individual initiative. For the next 500 years, the Mediterranean would not belong to the king who stood at the front, but to the centurion who knew when to turn around. The era of the god kings was over. The era of the professional soldier had begun. Please subscribe to our channel to relive more heroic chapters of history with us.